lecture. We are now opening the floor for question and answer sessions. So please raise your hand and ask questions. And one person can ask one question because there will be a lot of questions. So please raise your hand and ask. If you can speak louder, then.
I have two questions. My first question is, you said...
Wait, you said you have two questions. You're allowed one.
Yes. Okay. So I'll make it in half of it. The first part of the question is, in market, there will be state control. There will be no private ownership. What I know. So the problem with state ownership is that there is a chance of corruption and a lot of personal interest crop up within the state also. Like you see the model with Air India. Air India comes to my mind because it was running in loss and a lot of corruption was taking place over a period of time. So that was the problem. That is the problem with I think state control model. Though it's very ideal and best, but also there are personal interest and vested interest at times state can also behave like a bourgeois. The second part of the question is what happens to when technology, we are living in the era of technology and technology is taking away jobs. So now the workers have to cope up with the demands of the technology also. So how does the market socialism incorporate technology in it? Thank you, sir.
So let's take one more question.
Stan?
Hello, Mr. Shiva. Insofar as my question is concerned with regard to this, insofar as growth is concerned, it is as long as growth is coming from a capital augmenting kind of a technical progress, there is always a possibility of unemployment that exists because capital would take away jobs. Now, there is some sort of a presumption in this idea of market socialism that as whatever adjustments with regard to labor market and the unemployment scenario regarded as, the adjustments would happen in the public sector because the state has to absorb given the rights of the citizens that exist. Now, as long as the state is absorbing, fine, but the presumption also then means, the other side of the coin is that the private sector or whatever non-state sector corporations, firms, cooperatives that are producing, they produce on the lines of dynamism, on the lines of efficiency and profitability, not in the sense that we use in a private market economy framework of profitability, but essentially they need revenue. Now the issue is there is a conflict. As long as the state sector is able to absorb labor, produce more employment, their revenues would rise at the cost of the non-state sector. So the non-state sector would then be like, why should I produce? The presence of state sector itself is a disincentive to me because they are actually creeping into my revenues. How do you solve that?
That's only if they're competing with each other, right?
Yeah, but
if they're complementary sectors, that's not true.
No, but how would one be complementary? Because essentially the non-state sector, if the idea of the non-state sector is dynamism, profitability in the sense I need greater and greater levels of revenue, and if the state is able to take away the productive, not in the sense the capital, but the labor, the state is able to take the labor away, then why should I produce?
Okay. These are both very good questions. Let me answer them in order. The first one was, I think it's a very valid concern that state ownership oftentimes brings corruption. Yeah. Now, one point to keep in mind is that corruption is a funny word. We say corruption is when somebody is not doing the job that they're assigned to do, right? Because they're taking bribes from somebody, they're not doing what their office requires of them, and we consider that a public bad. But keep in mind that non-corruption is also a public bad, in that in bourgeois society, if you do your job the way you're supposed to do, most of the time you're destroying people's lives. So we shouldn't, when we worry about corruption, it should be with an eye towards, not towards seeing the counter to it or the alternative to it as being the status quo in the societies we have today, because for most of the population, the corruption would be preferable to people adequately doing the job of destroying their lives. Now, that doesn't in any way excuse corruption. And to my mind, the greater empowerment of the masses and the greater degree of workers' participation, workers' input, if not workers' control, is probably the best antidote to it. I don't know if you're ever going to eradicate corruption in every society. What you want to do is minimize it. There are two things that, in my view, will minimize it. One is the greater transparency of transactions that comes with democratizing the economic process. The other is that corruption is much, much worse in conditions of extreme scarcity. Because since there has to be a queue for everything, everything is scarce, so there's a queue for everything, it gives bureaucrats and administrators a much more leeway to take a bribe to help some people jump the queue. But in conditions of greater development, if the scarcity is reduced, then the scope for corruption also goes down, which is another reason why I think socialism is much more likely in a more developed setting than you had in Russia. By the way, India today is infinitely more developed than Russia was. It's still called a poor country, but its per capita income and its industrial base is orders of magnitude greater than what either China or Russia had. So even today, in India, those problems of corruption would be dramatically reduced. Now, both of you are talking about technology, and the problem of technical change and the way in which it creates unemployment. I am not too worried about that. You asked the question in different ways, so let me answer each component separately. For the first question, the worry was that this is, as you said, the age of technology, and that's going to be laying a lot of workers off. So how do we deal with that? To my mind, if you have two things going for you, one is a steady rate of growth, and the second is a public sector that's committed to being an employer of the last resort, or at the very least, having what the Swedes call an active labor market policy, which is the public sector providing labor exchanges and labor retraining so that workers who are falling out of the unproductive enterprises can be funneled into the more dynamic and productive enterprises. If you have either one of these two things, the problem of unemployment is dramatically reduced. Again, another reason why you have to worry about growth. In a stagnant economy, unemployment becomes a tremendous problem because there's no new enterprises coming online to absorb the workers that are being laid off. But in a more dynamic, fast-growing economy, you see, remember, there's two aspects to technical change, Marx pointed out. One is that firms, as they increase their labor productivity, lay off a lot of workers because they don't need as many workers. But at the same time, new firms are coming online. And people often forget the second part of a growth economy. If all you have was a finite number of firms, and they're laying off workers, you have a death spiral of increasing unemployment. But you don't have a finite number of firms in capitalism. What growth gives you is a dual process of workers being shed and adding to the reserve army of labor, and then new firms coming in, or older firms expanding their capacity, and then absorbing that labor. If you have a growth economy, you have a public sector that has a mandate to absorb labor, and then you also have employment exchanges. You might have unemployment, but it's not going to be because there's technical change. It's not going to be because there's robots. It's going to be because your administrative mechanisms are not working. And that brings me to the second question. I don't think you posed the question correctly. I don't think it's the case that in the model that we know of in market socialism, firms will feel that the public sector is draining them of the labor. Because remember, the private sector is also growing. So the private sector, some of the workers being laid off will be absorbed in the private sector. And some of them will go in the public sector. And they will also have the choice of working in the public or the private sector because there is a labor market. The only time, I think, workers will be excessively absorbed into the public sector is when there's stagnation in the private sector. But in that case, the public sector is doing a private good, not just a public good. because its ability to absorb and reemploy labor puts a floor on economic downturns. And so instead of a perturbation leading to a spiral, which is what a recession is, when some firms go out of business, they drive other firms out of business, then there's a reduction in aggregate demand, which means that all firms start feeling a squeeze on their profits. Instead of that, what you have is a baseline floor to the unemployment level, so that there's always a baseline to aggregate demand. This is the way I understand it. So I hope I understood your question correctly. I don't think the way you pose the problem is the problem that they'll have to worry about. The problem that they might have to worry about is not that the public sector will drain labor from the private sector, but that the private sector will become a burden on the public sector. If the public sector is taking up all the infrastructural, big expenditure, big investment responsibilities like power utilities, transportation, etc., it may not generate the kinds of revenues that the private sector is generating. And therefore, the private sector, if it's allowed to keep its own profits, will cherry pick all the most high growth commodities, leaving the low growth commodities to the public sector. And that has to be avoided in a viable market society.
Please raise your hand. Go to the back. They were. Please stand up and ask a question. Please keep it short.
It's all men so far, maybe a couple of minutes.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It's a very short question. I was wondering why do we call it as market socialism and not socialist market? Because
No reason. I suggest you start a campaign. No reason. I think it's a much better term. I really do. I think it's a much better term. There is a famous, there was an essay in I think it was 79 maybe, Diane Elson wrote an essay called Market Socialism or Socialized Markets. So you can't claim originality, but you can say you're carrying the torch.
So back, please.
Yeah, absolutely. We want geographical diversity too.
So you said you refer Germany is the best example of welfare state.
Say that again?
Germany is the best example of welfare state.
Germany, okay.
Okay.
I say Germany. Why the diversity of the caste system is the best.
But the irony is, Germany has the higher rate of taxation also. And what matters that the taxation is beared by the middle class, because absolutely poor people don't pay the taxes.
Yeah.
Absolutely rich people avoid the taxes through investment. So my point is welfare state really welfare? If it is welfare for whom?
Oh, it's absolutely welfare, because you're only looking at one side of the equation, which is who's paying the taxes. You also have to look at who's getting the benefits. So, if it's the case that the top 20% of the population is paying more taxes, as long as the benefits of those taxes are going to the bottom 60% disproportionately, it's called redistribution. That's a welfare state. And that was indeed the case in the golden era of welfare states. The taxation was borne by the wealthier people, and the fruits were enjoyed by the population at large, which means it was going downward.
This side, from this side, yeah. Please stand up.
So I think my question relates to the socialist part of your market proposal, and this is with regard to the incentive problem.
Okay.
So basically, if there is not going to be private property right, if the asset gains are going to be taxed away, and if the state is going to take care of your needs, what incentive is there for a worker to go and do their job?
Yeah.
Likewise, the same logic would apply to the private capitalist, that if their gains are going to be taxed away, if there is going to be no intergenerational wealth transfer, why would they innovate and produce new stuff?
Yeah, now remember, there's no private capitalists. So, but your question is still very...
What is the private sector meant for in this model?
Right.
What sense is it private?
I understand. So it's a very good question. First of all, you absolutely need incentives. Otherwise, people will not work. there are two kinds of incentives in a market socialist economy, the way I've described it. One is that if you don't work with a baseline level of efficiency, your firm will go under. You'll lose your job. Now, of course, you still have certain guarantees, as you said, but they are not guarantees of getting everything you need. It's certain baseline things. One thing we've learned from the Nordic experiments, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, and even countries like Austria, Finland, in all those countries, there was not a complete provision of basic necessities, but it was quite high. Now, if that affects your incentives to work, to be efficient, it should show up in two aggregate numbers. One is there should be a declining, what's called labor force participation in the economy. The second is there should be a declining rate of labor productivity or stagnant rate of labor productivity. Neither of these things happen. In fact, the Nordic countries have had a higher level of labor force participation in much of the post-World War II era than, say, the United States, which is a much less redistributed economy. And they also had higher rates of labor productivity growth than the United States did. So minimally, what that tells you, minimally, is that even if certain basic necessities are provided, people still have reason to want to have higher incomes because there's other things that they want, which the state isn't providing them for free. The other thing that it's telling you is that perhaps a lot of labor productivity comes from being happier at your job. Having more say, having a trade union that's backing you, not being bossed around, and all those things. So we shouldn't, although we should recognize that the width of the market is an important source of motivation for workers to work harder, we shouldn't think it's the only source. Having a better regime at work also helps, and market socialism will have some degree of that. It will also have an expanding commodity-producing sector, which gives you incentives to want to buy things for yourself and hence work harder. It would also have more participation and representation of the workplace, which means you feel that the workplace represents you, and therefore you will contribute to it more. And we have good grounds for believing this, because experiments of this kind have been conducted in the world as we know it today. And we see these gains across the board. So as long as you allow for some inequality, which I said you will, as long as you allow for firms to go under, which I said you will, and as long as you allow for the increased provision of commodities, which you will, I don't think the guarantees, the income guarantees and the decommodified goods is going to drain away the incentive. I hope that answers the question.
I have a follow-up question.
I'm the answer of disembodied questions. I don't care where they come from. So as long as nobody else minds.
So the point about this technical example is that there might not have been any force participation because of welfare service, because there existed private property right also, which gave people the certainty that if they work hard, the gains they will get to spend the way that they want to. But in your model, the difference is that the state is providing basic goods, but people also don't have private property rights.
No, but they do have profit sharing. So now, in capitalism, there's in fact a disincentive to work hard. And this is very well known. Workers don't want to work as hard as they could work because they know with absolute certainty they only get a tiny fraction of the fruits of the increased productivity. But if you allow workers to appropriate all the profits because there's no capitalists, and then share it amongst themselves, in fact, they have a greater incentive to work hard because more of the fruits of increased productivity are coming to them. Now, it's true that they don't have the incentive that someday I might become the capitalist. But I can tell you this for a fact, virtually nobody believes that. This is a dream middle-class people like you have. But workers, you have to be in fantasy land, and workers think, if I work hard, I'll be a boss someday. What they think is if I work hard, I might make it out. You know what? 60% of Americans say that if they have an emergency that requires $300, they cannot meet it. You think they're worried about becoming capitalists? This is the fantasy the middle class people have. What people want is to see the fruits of their labor being rewarded. And there's plenty of that in market socialism. Yes?
Yes, so my question is regarding a global market. So where would be this market socialism regarding whole imperial global power, and same time, what would be strategy? It would be a peaceful coexistence with imperialist market and neoliberal manufacturing policy, or whether it would compete with them in open market, and what would be...
Well, how many questions do you have?
It is one question.
No, it's not one. Peaceful coexistence is the opposite of militarism. So when you say, will there be peaceful coexistence? Yeah, I'm not condoning perpetual warfare. I think what you mean is, will they compete with...
Yes.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. So I think it's a very good question, because there's not going to be a spontaneous global transition to market socialism. It's going to happen in one country or a small cluster of countries. There's no easy answer to this. They're going to have to survive in a global capitalist economy, which is another reason they have to be efficient. They have to be dynamic.
Because it sounds very vulnerable compared to planning.
Yeah, you want a picture with no vulnerabilities? Planning was the most vulnerable thing there was. Is it time for me to wake up? Planning is the most vulnerable economic system there ever was. They were never able to. The only reason the Soviet Union was able to survive in the global market at all was because it went of its natural resources. It couldn't sell anything on the global market, nothing, because it was all shipped. So planning has absolutely no advantage in global trade. On the other hand, the social democracies, which were much closer to a market socialist economy than the Soviet Union, they did fabulously on the global market because they were worried about efficiencies. So I think it's a challenge. I do think it's a challenge. I think global trade will make you probably worry more about productivity than you want to be worried as a socialist economy. But the chances of meeting that challenge as compared to planning, there's just no question. Planning has been a disaster except for China. Like China, it's not clear how much I think China still has a powerful influence of the state on flows of investment, but it's by no means a centrally planned economy. So I don't think you can take the Chinese example as a vindication of central planning. You could make a case of market socialist, in which case it's a vindication of market socialism.
Next. Please.
So a lot of people talk about that the way forward for a capitalist economy involves a model of degrowth, a sustained reduction in production and consumption. And so as you said that this model of market socialism cannot align with the idea of degrowth because we have to avoid the stage of income stagnancy. So is there space in a market socialist economy to account for the ecological crisis, or the component of planning in this economy automatically avoids the situation of excess?
Very good question. I do really believe that one of the main responsibilities of any socialist economy, whether it be centrally planned or market socialist, is to deal with the ecological crisis. At the same time, it has to be a form of growth that appeals to the people. Not only does it have to appeal to the people once it's instituted, but when you're trying to, right now the biggest challenge we have is to bring the working class to the fight for socialism. Right? Okay, so let's start with degrowth. And let's start with the problem of bringing workers to socialism, and then the problem of instituting socialism, which is a question of the stability of the model. So first is the model's attractiveness, and second is sustainability. As regards attractiveness, the main problem with assessing degrowth arguments is it's not quite clear what they mean, because the main texts go all over the place. I've never been able to get a clear sense of what they mean. But it's very, very significant that they chose the word degrowth as their label, and not slower growth or deacceleration, degrowth. Now, if degrowth means what you said, which is reducing the level of production in absolute terms, and reducing consumption in absolute terms, here's the problem you face. For working people around the world, over the past 40 years, there's been an enforced regime of reduced consumption. Standards of living have gone down. In the United States, for the first time in 100 years, life expectancy has gone down. Think about this. Life expectancy is going down. They can't meet basic needs. In India, in a poor country like India, the struggle for most of the population is a struggle for survival. Now here come these college-educated people with their dreadlocks and their nose ring and all that, and they say, here's the solution. We want socialism. You know what that means? Comrade, you're consuming too much. You're going to say that to a landless peasant. You're going to say that to an American or British worker. What they're going to do is say, stay right there. There's a fascist down the hall that I'd really like to talk to. Because the fascist is saying, I'll give you rising standards of living. So if degrowth means what the label says it means, I think it doesn't have a chance in hell. And right now it's a philosophy that's only debated amongst college students. Now, if those college students suffer unemployment for 4 or 5 years, then I'd like to see if they're still talking about degrowth. The same worry pervades the problem of sustainability. Because, as this friend here said, you're probably likely to have islands of market socialism in a global capitalist economy. You face the same problem the Soviet Union faced, which is everybody in the Eastern Bloc saw that Americans and British and Germans are swimming in commodities. And they are confronted with constant shortages. That really deprived the system of a lot of its legitimacy. One reason why the Chinese model has survived, even though it's an autocratic model, is the extraordinary rise in people's standards of living. So on both counts, attracting people to the politics of socialism and in sustaining it, if degrowth means what I think it means, and let me just say, there's a point after which I stop reading the stuff because none of it makes any sense. But if it means what I think it means, it's a hobby horse of people, mostly students, college students in elite universities, and you'll never go beyond this. Now it's a bit of a downer. When I say elite universities, yes, I mean you.
Yeah, please. Go back.
You know, when you propose this model, do you think, I wonder, to what extent you would have addressed the concerns Nozick, Hayek, in that sense, like, and you already said it, like, global sovereign wealth fund, Nordic, and progressive taxation, social safety net, isn't it the way Singapore does it, or isn't it already an alternative to this? And last one, once this is an end to, can we expect like world system theory manuals? Is it an end to your seeing that one at the macro level? You know, once this.
I didn't understand the last one.
The last one, like, you see, the dependency theories and the world system. Once this get materialized, this is an end to that.
Let me start with the last question. You're saying that if this materializes, would it be an end to world systems theory?
Yeah, all those
right. No, because I don't think there ever was a world in which world systems theory was correct. So, the end to world systems theory came the moment it was born. I just think it never adequately explained the structure of the global economy, nor did it adequately explain the dynamics, the underlying causal structure of the economy, nor was it able to accurately explain the origins of the global economy. So, as a theory, I think it was stillborn. I think it was born dead. But and I don't think it's basically already gone. I mean, you don't really have any active. I don't know of any after Giovanni Arrighi's demise. I don't know who's developing world systems or dependency theory. I know you guys still read it in your college textbooks, but that's because they're hopelessly out of date. So that's the answer to that question. And if I had time, I would explain to you.
Even market socialism came to be the regions of the world that would still remain underdeveloped and exploited. Would this come to whatever the theoretical advance?
Well, I haven't said anything about interstate relations except in the answer to this question. So I haven't said anything about how market socialism would affect the relations, economic relations between countries. I can say something about that, but it would be extemporaneous. I wouldn't be able to make an argument. I just have to tell you what I think through assertion. Okay? So let me come to that in a second. Your other question, the first part of your question was, what about Nozick and Hayek?
Yeah.
Well, Nozick and Hayek raise two very different concerns. Hayek's concerns are primarily economic, although there is absolutely a normative component to it. Nozick's are exclusively normative. Nozick has nothing to say about the economic dilemmas of market socialism, right? I hope you were listening. the whole talk was about worrying about freedom, liberty, and political participation, which is a libertarian worry, and about worrying about efficiency and solving the information. Hayek is all about information. My critique of planning was all about information. Right? But I don't think Hayek developed the incentives problem of information quite as well as people later did, because he was writing at a very early point. So his worry was not that people would have the incentive to provide wrong information. His worry was that there was just too much information. And to the extent that people were unable to provide the correct information, it wasn't because they had the wrong incentives, it was because there was too much uncertainty in their futures and they couldn't correctly anticipate what they want 5 years from now. And the economy has to know, the planner has to know, because there's something about 5-year plans. So they have to know what the economy is going to look like down the road. Those are very germane, those are very legitimate concerns, and I did try to, in a short lecture, address them the best I could. I'll say this about Nozick. Sure, one has to worry whether it's Nozick or the Republican critique, which is freedom from arbitrary authority, freedom of the individual. But what made Nozick's entire theory crash and burn is that he had an incredibly crazily idealized version of what the market is. So in Nozick, the market is a domain of freedom and liberty. But that's because he completely accepts the marginalist description of what a market is. And so that you can turn the tables on Nozick and say that, sure, we have to worry about liberty, but here's the problem. On libertarian grounds, capitalism is unjust. You can show that easily, if you adequately describe what a market is. So I wouldn't feel defensive or insecure about Nozick. I would say that Nozick should worry about us, that is the Marxists.
And, can I have a follow-up?
No, we have.
Yes, you're right.
A very small question about, is there any space for the idea of commons in the market socialism, having common resources that are governed by people?
Yeah, I mean, that's what public ownership of the means of production means. Or do you mean like grasslands where quaint animals, they have none? And you should get out of that whole thing, this exoticizing of the rural and all that business. There's an idea of common ownership and common responsibility. That's the essence of socialism. But I don't know if we're going to necessarily worry intrinsically about having wasteland where there's lots of kangaroos or something. I mean, I'm sure it'll come around, but I don't think that's a... So to answer your question, yes, there's a space for it. I can't tell you how large the space is. No, you already asked the question. Yes.
So we'll take only 2 questions now because we have limited of time. So please.
So which is the academic talk? So we started with left is becoming irrelevant, or left is working on or functioning on some ideas which have become irrational over time.
Which have what? Become what?
Which have become impractical or irrational over time. So basically we try to revive an inefficient firm. So my question is basically, there are already 2
Wait,
ideas.
you said you tried to revive an inefficient firm?
In general, when we give ideas to left, or when we talk about in context of India, so we give ideas that left should change its focus from these points to these points.
Yeah.
So basically, we try to give ideas how left should revive itself.
Yeah.
So basically, my question, there are already two models, even in last century also. One is capitalist and other is socialist. And practically, most of the countries have already been working somewhere between these two models. Whether we take case of Nordic economies or even somehow India and China also, because none of them is completely planned economy. So it is already working somewhere between capitalism and socialism. So how is this idea any new in 21st century? I mean, it has already been existing in 20th century also.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Certainly, I think if you look at the Nordic countries, they've already instituted many components of a market socialist idea. The big difference between that and market socialism, I'll come to China in a minute. The big difference between them and market socialism is that they retained a class of capitalists. So while they have lots of redistribution, they retained the private ownership of these massive firms that they have. And that's a good lesson in why social democracy has limits. Because while they met all their efficiency goals, and they met a lot of the redistributive goals, since the middle of the 1980s, we've seen a steady retreat of the ambitions and the success of the redistributive and the laborist components of the Scandinavian model. Why have we seen that steady retreat? Well, while the way I look at it is while they succeeded on the economic front, they lost on the political front. And the way they lost was there's a point up to which the capitalist class withdrew its support for the social democratic model, and then, in fact, turned the tables on it and launched a steady political and economic offensive against it. And that's why it's been retreating. It's not been a glacial, uncoordinated retreat. There's been a quite conscious move by big capital to no longer support the system and to undermine it. But that means it's a very good reason not to have the class of private capitalists. That's the big difference between social democracy and market socialism, or socialized markets. I think if most of the world could become like Sweden in 1970, I'd be very happy. Problem is, Sweden in 1970 was vulnerable to its own capitalists. To my mind, social democracy will be very desirable, but hard to sustain over time as long as the political power that comes with asset ownership is unequal. And you have to therefore take away both the incentive that comes with private ownership to dismantle social democracy and the ability that comes with private ownership. Now, as for China, yes, I think China too has very attractive elements to it. As long as you're not a worker, as long as you're not working in Foxconn. Yeah. So the dictatorial, autocratic elements of the Chinese model is something I think one would want to avoid while maintaining its economic dynamism.
Yeah, from this side, please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask that in your model of market socialism, what are the incentives to produce as well as consume sustainably? Because your model...
There is never an incentive. This is neither a middle-class fantasy. There's never an incentive to produce sustainably. If you want sustainable economies, it has to be macroeconomically regulated. In a market, the incentive is always to just stay alive if you're a firm, to get the maximum wage that you can get if you're a worker. And you cannot tell them as individuals, don't shop at such and such place, don't consume such and such, until you're living their lives. So the incentive, you cannot say we want to incentivize sustainable consumption. What you want to say is we want to rule out unsustainable consumption. Just take it off the table. And that requires massive state regulation. So you're misconstruing the problem as one of individual incentives. In a market economy or an economy where there's lots of corruption, where there's scarcity, the individual incentive is always just to do the best for yourself, regardless of the long-term consequences. So there's no such incentive. Yes, you had a question.
Yeah. My question is
Can you just for 1 second?
What would the transition to market socialism entail?
That's a very good question. The question is, what would the transition to market socialism entail? I don't know. So let me say something that will be very, very unpopular with some of you. I don't think a revolutionary road to socialism is possible. For two reasons. What it takes to have a revolution usually requires a kind of political organization that is highly centralized, oftentimes clandestine, and once it gets power, it doesn't give up that power. That's the experience we've seen. And the burden of proof is entirely on the people who advocate for that kind of change to show how it is consistent with democracy. Entirely on them. Because every bit of historical evidence shows that it's not true. Now, that's just inductive truths, and inductive truths are simply generalizations, and any generalization can be wrong. But the other reason is that I just don't think revolutions are possible anymore. That revolutions happen in a world that was so different from this one. Every single revolution happened in an era where state formation was still incomplete, and where state breakdown was happening. Lenin's the single greatest sentence in the history of social science comes from Lenin. And today's revolutionaries only remember half of it. He said revolutions happen when the ruled are no longer willing to abide by the existing order, and the rulers can no longer rule in the old way. So what he says is two things. When people are no longer willing to accept their condition, and when the ruler's ability to impose order breaks down, in other words, state breakdown. Revolutionaries today always focus on the first part, and they say, if we just get enough people, and they're really angry, and they're really mobilized, we can have a revolution. No, what you'll do is get it destroyed. What you also need, nobody makes a revolution. What they do is take advantage of a revolutionary situation. Those situations are almost never caused by direct voluntary action. They are caused by a cluster of factors that generate the breakdown of state power. Today's states, thinking that they're going to break down, it might happen, one never knows, but as Wayne said in the 90s in a great movie called Wayne's World, it might happen, but also monkeys might fly out of my butt.
So before
so how do you see agricultural production in this model, and whether peasantry would convert into workers?
I don't think you can have a viable high-growth economy with loads of petty commodity production, which is what peasants are. So you will have to have an agrarian transition. Luckily, most of the world history has already done the job, as I said. In a country like India, you will need to have some sort of transition out of agriculture. Now, the good news is, in India, almost nobody wants to be in agriculture. They're stuck in it because the urban employment is not there for them. If you have a high-growth economy with real employment generation, people will leave those villages. They all want to come and live in the cities. And this is another middle-class fantasy that peasants love their rustic lives, they're poor and they're happy. They're mostly miserable and unhappy. So I think the first thing you'll have to do is have the kind of public investments that provide jobs in urban areas or jobs in rural areas and small townships. We still call them rural, even though they're townships, where people can get jobs. Because agriculture imposes real limits on productivity growth. So you need to move out of agriculture.
We apologize for not taking all the questions because of limited time. So before winding up these sessions, we as a JNU Academic would like to thank to the Dean, Office of the Staff of the School of Arts and Aesthetics. In these times where there is a very few spaces available for academic activities, SAR is the first and last resort for us. A very great thank you for our students, and a great thank for our audience who always turns up in such a large numbers, even when the registration process is still going on in the university. There is an arrangement of tea outside. Please have it, and don't forget to contribute to monitoring because we really need your support for organizing such a successful events. And on the one important note, on the 19th we have a book discussions planned on the book title Secularism as a misdirection by Professor Navita Menon. See you all there. Thank you.